Hello and welcome to Blogging Heads. This is Hanna Rosin. I am the editor of XX, the women's section of Slate, and today I am talking to Rebecca Traister at Salon, who has a great new book out called Big Girls Don't Cry, which is largely about the 2008 campaign, but also talks about the kind of historical significance of that campaign. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Hanna. I'm so pleased to be talking to you.
Thank you so much. Me too. So why don't you just explain initially why you felt that the 2008 campaign was a historic moment that needed to be recorded in book length? What about it was special?
Well, I should say that during the bulk of the primary campaign, during which Hillary Clinton was running for president, and therefore in some ways, you know, was the crucial female figure here because she was the first person to do this, or at least do it as realistically as she did. Shirley Chisholm had run in 1972 in a mostly symbolic campaign, but here was Hillary, who was the first woman to really be taken seriously for the possible nomination for the presidency. But during her campaign, which I was covering because I was writing about gender and politics and media for Salon, it actually, I don't think it really ever occurred to me to write a book about it. I thought it was an incredible story that was unfolding, but there was so much antipathy toward Hillary at that point, and it was so, I mean, if it did cross my mind, I'm sure that I sort of said, are you kidding? Nobody's ever going to want to hear the name Hillary Clinton after this is over. You know, there was so much like, just let this be over. And so it wasn't as though I was watching this story, which was very powerful and very gripping. I mean, those primaries were like twists and turns and, oh my God, what's happening? And everybody's predictions were wrong. But it wasn't until Palin was picked, sort of to sop up the votes that, you know, Hillary may have left behind, which didn't really work at all. But when Palin was picked and I was watching a pundit on television try to explain Palin, and specifically talk about Palin and why she appealed to women or why women reacted to her, and whoever the pundit was, and I actually don't even remember, was just getting it wrong and saying something like, well, we know we're post-gender. And I just thought, oh my God, no.
Right.
And
well,
also,
it's really, yeah. I mean, for we who write for lady blogs and on these issues, we remember that moment well because that's when Double X Factor on Slate was starting, and at first it's sort of like we're talking about backorder issues, and suddenly it became clear that all these issues we've been talking about were kind of the central issues of the campaign. So it's a very memorable moment. Before we go to Palin, which we'll get to in 1 second, this is extremely familiar to us because we follow this closely, but just kind of run through for 1 second the arc of what happened to Hillary. So you have this woman who's the, gets closer to candidacy than any woman before her, but just give us a sort of little recap of what happened and how women responded to her and how generationally women responded to her, just to remind people who are listening kind of what the drama was all about, and then we'll move to the kind of, the serious, unexpected drama of Palin that came later.
Well, the important thing to remember about Hillary is that when she entered the race as this historic candidate, she actually had like 2 decades of baggage. Coming in, because it's not as though we had met her as a candidate. We'd met her as the First Lady in 1992 and as sort of incendiary figure on the American cultural scene to whom especially a lot of feminists had really identified and affected, 15, 20 years earlier because she had been the first Lady and really one of the first truly public women who resembled what life was like for many post-second wave women with families and careers in the United States, and they'd never seen themselves reflected before in any kind of political light. And here was this First Lady who broke all these rules and was very controversial and came in for a ton of criticism. And so there had been this incredibly strong bond between a whole generation of American women and Hillary Clinton. And there'd also been this incredibly strong resistance to her from people who disapproved of her, who were shocked by any number of things, her ambition, the degree of her involvement in policymaking in the White House. She had the health care debacle soon after Bill Clinton became president. And so there was all this baggage, and one of the ironies is that going into the election, those women who'd so strongly embraced Hillary for so many years had actually grown very distant from her. Because in her road over those 15 years, from being this kind of iconoclastic First Lady who had stood in, however inaccurately, for all that was scary about liberated American womanhood in the second half of the 20th century, she had to, in order to position herself realistically to become a presidential candidate, to be a senator first from New York, and then to move into contention for the presidency as a super centrist compromiser. She had all the Clinton baggage. There was, had she gained sympathy and support because she'd been victimized during her husband's sex scandal. There was all that, and in fact, what it had done is put all this distance between those who had first so embraced her, and her run for president, so that it began really with a lot of feminists not being at all excited about the fact that they were going to have this first woman running for president, even though she was a Democrat. And then, and Hillary didn't help that any by, she hired a team of advisors, largely borrowed from her husband, led by Mark Penn. They were men. Which is interesting because one of the things that Hillary had always had was this team of incredibly dynamic, brilliant women called Hillaryland, who'd worked with her through the White House and for decades. And she didn't turn to them to lead her campaign. She turned to a bunch of guys whose use of conventional wisdom, and it wasn't wrong, historically speaking. I mean, we'd never done this before. Who knew actually how to run a woman, right? But the advice was, don't be a woman. Don't, let's obscure what makes you different from the other candidates. And again, this is not to say that was crazy. No woman had ever successfully run for president before. And certainly everything that's feminized in a political sphere is often devalued. So she sort of presented herself as this pugilistic, like, I'm in it to win it, talked in boxing metaphors. And the problem was that her opponent, her surprise opponent, Barack Obama, was eating her lunch when it came to attracting women voters, because he had adopted this very feminized language of hoping and dreaming and connecting to people. And he had Oprah, stumping for him, the sort of leading female voice who really knew how to talk to women. And so you saw this evolution with Hillary's campaign, and it was a very slow and ultimately too late evolution, where she really had to readjust how she spoke. And I think that certainly by the end of her campaign, she did become more authentically female and actually embrace her role as a women's leader. Notably, the moment that she really embraced her role as a women's leader was in defeat, in her concession speech, and this was after the very, very protracted primary during which she had stayed in and continued to fight despite the fact that everybody and their grandfather wanted her to concede and let Barack Obama take the nomination. And she had stayed in and incurred the wrath of her opponent's supporters, and incurred the increasing support of her supporters who thought, like I did, I became a Hillary supporter by the end, that this was just a fantastic explosion of ideas of how women were supposed to behave in the political arena. So when she conceded was the moment she gave her speech where she talked about, putting cracks in the glass ceiling, and if we can send 50 women into space, we can send one into the Oval Office, and all these really great sort of empowering lines about gender. But that was only once she lost. She was only able to really do that once she had been defeated and was no longer threatening.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, the things that we remember now that she's an elder statesman in our lives, and that a lot of the controversy and ambivalence about her has faded, are two moments. Is the one in which she cried during the primary, and the one in which she made the speech about the cracks in the glass ceiling. So it's funny. Those really stand out in her campaign history, and nobody really remembers Mark Penn or any of the other stuff. And so when you think back, it seems perfectly obvious that she should have chosen the route of the kind of rousing historic moment. On the other hand, it's antithetical to her personality and how she had behaved until then, and also to her generation at some level, which was a little bit uncomfortable with kind of sticking with, it's fine to say I'm not going to bake cookies because that's a little bit defensive and antagonistic, but it's a little different to say, here we are, the great feminist. I mean, it's just not who she is and not who her generation of feminist is. So it was a little bit problematic. And we haven't even mentioned, so that's how her people responded to her, how a younger generation responded to her. And I bring this up because we're later going to talk about Susan Faluti's story in Harper's this month, which talks about the mother-daughter divide. But there was clearly a mother-daughter divide during the Hillary campaign.
Yes, there certainly was. Part of my argument in the book is that has a lot to do with the mismanagement of her campaign. I mean, as somebody who was reporting on the election at the time, I'm 35, so I no longer fall into the category that most people, I'm not in my 20s. But I feel like I know quite a bit about a young young feminist communities, certainly, and a lot of them were not supporting Hillary. The young women on the blogosphere, some of them were, but actually really not as many as you'd think. And in reporting on the campaign, I also talked to any number of young women and young men. And one of the things that I feel pretty strongly, and it's always impossible to say retrospectively, and I am certainly not a campaign strategist, however, Hillary made no effort to connect to young women. And that's something that often got forgotten. There were all kinds of exhortations from older women, whether they were kind of mild ones from Gloria Steinem or really frankly, just crazily intense spankings being administered by Robin Morgan. I mean, she wrote a screed, Goodbye to All That Number 2, in which she just let loose on the perfidy and stupidity of young women. And there was all this blaming of young women for not doing the right thing and supporting Hillary, and what very few of the sort of elder women, and by the way, I also should clarify, not all older women, as I said before, were supporting Hillary either, and any number of well-known feminists, including Katha Pollitt and Barbara Ehrenreich were not supporting Hillary Clinton.
Right.
But for those who were, there was this incredible anger at these young women, and my argument in the book is that, and we'll talk about this with Flutie, that this was actually symptomatic of tension that had been boiling that had nothing to do with Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was, like so much of the rest of the 2008 election cycle, an excuse to let loose with conversations we'd sort of all been bubbling to have, but there hadn't been a release for them.
Right.
But the thing that all these people who were chiding young women about did not take into account was that Hillary simply, her campaign was not working to reach these young women. And I truly believe and there are people, Shelby Knox, who's a young activist who travels to college campuses, Jessica Valenti, who's a young activist who travels to college campuses and was talking to women. I believe that there were a lot more young women there for the asking. But Hillary was not asking them. And Barack Obama's, one of the masterful things about his campaign that we know is that from the beginning, he knew he wasn't going to be able to rely entirely on establishment voters, and he took a huge gamble, a gamble that had been considered very stupid since the sort of McGovern race in which young people failed to come out and vote for the man they'd made the candidate. No political candidate really relies on younger people, but Barack Obama had to take this gamble because he knew he couldn't rely on the Democratic establishment. And he went to such brilliant lengths, his campaign, to talk to young voters, to get in their phones and on their computers and to go where they congregate. And so he was the person who mobilized young voters. And I really think you can't take that sort of campaign and strategic dynamic out of the equation when you talk about the generational difference in how people voted for Hillary. If Hillary had taken a similarly respectful and serious approach to young women from the start, I don't think we would have had the same kind of imbalances that we had.
Right, I agree with you. And it's not just a question of parsing out, sectional politics by age, political constituencies. I think it's also about telling a story. I mean, that's one thing that should have been obvious about her campaign. You kind of need a story for people to connect to, and there wasn't really a story. I mean, the story was like, I'm very competent, I'm as competent as the next guy, and that's not really so much of a story,
but
as
she
opposed to
could
just
have
creating
made
a story
the
about history, but trying at the same time not to scare people. I mean, that would have been, good advice, I suppose.
She could have made the story, and in fact, one of the sort of attitudes that often older feminists complain about in young women is this sort of empty girl power story, right? There's there was just the book, there was a book sort of complaining about the emptiness of this, the sort of faux girl power, Wonder Woman stuff that is often just dismissed by older feminists as having nothing to do with political action, and that's fair enough. However, I see quite an easy path. And again, it's hard to say retrospectively she should have done this because there is no historical model that suggests it would have succeeded. It's a gut instinct, maybe from those of us who spend more time hearing from younger women because we're in the business we're in and online and that kind of stuff. It's a gut feeling about how there's a generational change that has a larger appetite for some at least mild feminist rhetoric than maybe those even 10 years older than them had, right? But I think that she could have told a story that actually played into that very kind of girl power ethos. It's what Sarah Palin did. I mean, that's a very complicated other side of it because Sarah Palin doesn't actually push policy that supports women. But it's certainly the sort of you go girl, Title IX version of feminism that Palin played quite masterfully, at least if you look at the women who do support her. And I think there's a possibility Hillary could have done that too, and it might have worked with, what Obama was pushing with young people was not much more sophisticated than that. It was hope and change,
Right. Right, that's what I mean. You could have created a story without sort of setting off a lot of the fear that, Mark Penn worried that story might set off. Now, let's leave that conversation aside because I want to come back to it at the end and talk about the new debate on generational feminism. And let's just move on to what happened when Sarah Palin entered the scene because it's so relevant to what's going on now. And it turned out that, what came out of that campaign in terms of a political narrative for women, even if it's not reflected in the actual numbers of women elected, was this story of the Mama Grizzlies and their claim to be feminists. And I mean, that seems to be the story that we are very vividly living with right now with Christine O'Donnell's election and sort of every month, something Nikki Haley and this new genre type of woman and this new movement, we could even call it, that has entered American politics. So it was interesting for me to read your book and recall a moment in which we had much more deeply ambivalent and less well-formed thoughts about Sarah Palin than we all have now. And so talk a little bit about that. What happened when she unexpectedly entered the scene and kind of switched everything up?
Well, first of all, she entered at exactly, I was saying that Hillary only managed to make her feminist case, without using the word feminism, but make her feminist case in defeat. And then the moment at which Palin entered the scene, the very first speech she gave, in Dayton, Ohio, when she was introduced and she had her kids behind her, she introduced them, and as I write in the book, here she was introducing them as credentials. She had all these young kids, and we have a history of distrusting any woman who has, any young woman who has a family who's putting herself up for a big job because we think she's not a good mother. I mean, and here she was presenting her kids as a credential.
And I think that's actually a really important insight in the book, that particular way of phrasing it. I mean, you do have to remember it's not that there haven't been working women in politics. It's just that you've always had to explain away your children. So it was incredibly, I think, kind of radical. You could even say moving to say this is part of what makes me qualified.
Totally
and I think also historically and even in other countries, people have generally put out the mama role as important. Like I'm the matriarch of the country, but not the idea of having actually been a mother, actually raising some concrete children. Like that was fairly new idea.
That's right. And it's funny, if you go back to that speech, you see the foundations. I can't believe, and I've written a book about this, I can't believe we're still talking about Sarah Palin, So, and I can't believe how much of what in that very first speech is still reverberating right now, because what she also did in that speech that in purely partisan terms shocked me and my colleagues. We were in Denver. It was the end of the day after Obama's speech at the 2008 convention, and we were all in Denver watching Palin's introduction together, and she began by celebrating herself as a female history maker, which is fair, she was, but it was so startling to see somebody just do that from the start and say, I'm going to break that glass ceiling that Hillary put cracks in. And she also called out and put herself in line with, again, accurately, Hillary Clinton and Geraldine Ferraro as the two women who had been major party contenders for executive office, and she was the third. But that she invoked these Democratic women in her bid for the Republican vice presidency was shocking to me in a purely partisan, oh my God, she's talking about Democrats, and her crowd is cheering.
Right.
And now we see what has happened since with Palin talking about feminists and Susan B. Anthony and suffragists and putting herself in line with the history of the American women's movement at the same time that everything she pushes ideologically works in opposition to the goals of the women's movement, but she herself actually embodies many of its victories.
Right. No, it is funny. It's like the first generation of reality TV contestants. They seem authentic. They're kind of there, hanging out. You sort of, are drawn in by what they say, even though it's full of contradictions. And then in the second wave, when the series gets renewed, everything starts to seem incredibly self-conscious and have all this artifice. I mean, I think that's what goes on with Sarah Palin and her feminist line. And the first time, it kind of took us by surprise, and it was so raw, and it kind of made a kind of sense. But then the second time she brought up the line and really, formulated and turned into a talking point, it puts a lot of women on edge, makes them defensive, and it feels self-conscious, and it feels like she's just sort of running through a line or co-opting or kind of messing with us and, calling everyone an Ewok. So there is a big difference between how we respond to that same line now and how, how feminists would have responded to it in the first round. So that's a really complicated moment. I'm happy to have this conversation because when I read the book, I was feeling like there was more I want to hear from you about, kind of the sort of the epilogue, so you had Sarah Palin, you had all these hilariously confused reactions to her, including the nightmares that you had, which I found extremely hilarious, of Sarah Palin. The one that I liked the most was your kind of Sex and the City one of Sarah Palin, like having dining with all of your friends in a restaurant and you're outside banging on the window. It was an extremely funny way of kind of...
It's totally accurate. I did not make any of that stuff up. I really had those dreams. She got under my skin. And that's also, by the way, something else that I think is really important to acknowledge is that a lot of this book I'm writing about the way that the media talked about Hillary or Palin or Michelle Obama and Elizabeth Edwards in extremely gendered and, in the case of Michelle Obama, racialized ways, often unconsciously. Sometimes you can't imagine that it was unconscious because it was so bold. But one of the things that I think is really important to, I'm not out to be a gender cop. One of the things that, I'm sort of seeking to examine the patterns and the ways that we talk about women that are different from how we talk about men. And one of the things that really struck me was that my feelings about Palin were definitely amplified by the fact that she was a woman.
Right. Absolutely. Right. I mean, you do a good job in the book of explaining why we can't discount that. It's not just a matter of sort of picking apart the ways in which the media or male commentators talk about women, like all this great Tucker Carlson, the castrating voice of Hillary, which I'd also forgotten about. But also, maintaining this idea that it's relevant. I mean, that you can't completely discount that. I want to stick with this for 1 second, sort of Sarah Palin and Christine O'Donnell and the rest of them. It's, one thing that I have a hard time getting around, I was just reading about Nikki Haley, who's running for governor in South Carolina, and the things that they say, I mean, Sarah Palin aside, because she's kind of playing a social media game a lot of the time, the things that they say are, they're very patriarchy-busting, culturally speaking. I mean, absolutely, policy-wise, they support nothing that a traditional feminist ought to support or anything that might actually make women's lives better. But as cultural icons, I find that they say kind of, pretty radically straightforwardly radical things about the patriarchy in their particular states and how it behaves and what it does and how it locked them out and how they intend to just step over it, And I personally have a hard time understanding why that's not feminist or shouldn't count as feminist. Well, it's much less apologetic than a lot of feminists from the left have been in years, It's like in South Carolina, there's just an old boys club. They sit behind the door. They smoke their cigars. They pass all these pork bills without signing their names to it. Screw it. I'm not going to sit on the school board is what Nikki Haley's attitude is, basically. Right. I'm passing a bill that says that they have to sign their names to the legislation they pass. Like, there's nothing feminist about that. It's not like... it's not like a child care bill or anything, but is there nothing feminist about that?
Well, sure there is. I mean, my argument about this whole question and about, are these Republican women feminist? Are they not feminist? I think that of course it's the question we're most tempted to ask because it puts it in the easiest possible language to absorb and to give sort of an inflammatory answer about. But I think that I actually argue that it's a little more complicated than that. To my mind, feminism, it's a big myth that feminism is this closed club, right? That there's, that you sort of renew your membership application every year and that if you violate the rules, you get deactivated or ejected or whatever, Right. I mean, that's a myth that is propagated by anti-feminists who want to portray it as a sort of powerful monolith. But of course, feminism has never in its whole history been a monolith. It has been a sort of a total mashup of competing agendas, priorities, perspectives, races, ethnicities, religions, sexualities, and it has gone through a million stages of argument and disagreement and conflict about who it's supposed to represent, who it does represent, its failures, its shortcomings, and that's all happened from within feminism. So to my mind, this is another iteration of that, and it's one that I think is actually...
But doesn't the question become, are they outside the conversation? I mean, I feel like that just asks the next layer of question. Absolutely, and your book is the greatest example of that. I mean, that's something your book does really well, is take that conversation really seriously and explain the stakes of that conversation, both for feminism and for the nation. But at some level, aren't we saying they're faking it? They're outside the conversation. They're not sincere.
I think they're inside the conversation. I think that's the point. I think feminism is about, first of all, feminism is a construction of language, right? Again, there's no club. So if you have a group of 20 mama grizzlies all calling themselves feminists, then guess what? They get to be feminists. They're feminists. You know, they call themselves, that's what any of us, the only reason that any of us who do call ourselves feminists get to be feminists is because we call ourselves that. Or members of the women's movement, or womanists, or, you know, there are other words that, you know, we all use to sort of express our engagement in a conversation and exchange about the furthered power of women, right? So, yes, sure, they get to be feminists. But then once they're inside the conversation, then they become part of the conflict that is feminism. And the ever sort of evolving, roiling. And so then they do get to hear from other feminists about why their policy stances are not feminist. Now, but by the same token, I think it's important that those of us who do vociferously disagree with them on politics and policy and ideology also don't simply throw the baby out with the bathwater and fail to acknowledge. I've heard far too many of my compatriots sort of say, no, they're not feminists, which again is just, I don't think anybody gets to say that. And in addition, we reject everything about them because they're so anti-feminist. And as somebody who believes that their policy is fundamentally anti-feminist and anti-woman, I also think it's really important that we acknowledge that A, they are the product of feminist success, B, they represent some things that many of us haven't yet even gotten to. Palin reaching over, and I read about this in the book, the moment after the vice presidential debate where Palin reaches for Trig, the newborn baby, and there are 40 totally cynical reasons why that baby is on the stage with her that night. But they're not so different from the 40 cynical reasons that male candidates have had their families on stages for eons. And to me, that was the most moving Palin moment, because to me, this is something women have never been able to do before. This woman is being considered for vice president, and she has a newborn baby. Wow, this is actually progress made manifest, and it doesn't, and that's regardless of the fact that I think that Palin's positions are anti-progress, okay? And we have to be able to acknowledge that both are true. We have to be able to have a conversation that is complex enough to acknowledge both realities, that there is a good thing about having an increased number of women on the, you know, even if, you know, traditional feminists happen not to be Republicans, the fact that there are Republican women running is good. That's part of what feminism is about. It's about increasing opportunities for everybody, even those we don't agree with.
Yeah, and the hard part for me is I think in some ways, in terms of the symbolism, they are more powerful mythbusters than another Democratic woman running, even though in policy terms, you know, what you call, would any of the things they actually advocate be, you know, considered pro-woman? I mean, I take someone like Christine O'Donnell. She's a little more complicated for me because, you know, she doesn't come from a southern state or a state that's been sort of traditionally hostile to women and women legislators. She is the kinds of things that she's done over her life, you know, like the she's actually done policy things. You know, she's been involved as at least as a spokesperson in my mind the wrong side of sexual politics, sort of throughout her youth, you know, and at the Concerned Women for America and her masturbation and condoms, you know, all the things that we've been making fun of on YouTube videos for the last month. And so, and she isn't, you know, the language that she talks about is not particularly like I'm stepping over the patriarchy the way it is with some of these other women who are running for
Although
governor.
She did sue the company that she was working for.
Yes, and then you have that weird particular twist, which is completely heretical in her, you know, in her world of conservative women, because I think, you know, to speak most broadly philosophically, there is the kind of natural order of things. You know, there's a sort of natural way men and women behave, and she talks about husbands submitting to their wives and all the usual kind of biblical principles. And then there's the legal system, and particularly the secular legal system, which whose job it is to kind of overturn those natural principles. I mean, this is sort of a Christian conservative speak here, and she resorted to the enemy, basically. I mean, so it's so confusing,
Yes.
It's so confusing. And again, whether that lawsuit is legitimate or not, and I think no one's really sufficiently dug into it. It's an extremely confusing moment where she suddenly thinks, like a lot of these other women, and I, in the piece I read, called it 9-to-5 feminism. There's a kind of feminism which is not sort of a part of the progressive movement in which it's just like the man is out to screw me, and I'm going to fight the man. I'm going to tie him to his chair, and I'm going to make him pay. And so that's the side that she taps into, and it's a kind of cultural, kind of, very reactive, instinctive, and not very thought out or policy progressive kind of feminism, but it's something,
But but these are the complexities that actually, I believe that as confusing as this conversation is, like so much that comes out of 2008, and so much that we're just grappling with these days now in general, and certainly, I mean, your End of Men piece is a big part of this. The Man Up cover on Newsweek, we are the jobs numbers and the number of men who've lost their jobs during the recession, the new information about, young single women earning more, we are in an age in which these questions are becoming, exponentially more complex. Right. And I think that this is why I believe that these kinds of exchanges, while sort of mind-bending, and there is no easy answer, are actually really good for keeping the women's movement vibrant. Because if we just, like the rest of America, we have this eagerness to say, oh, we're over this stuff, we're post-gender, we're post-race, which we obviously know is not true. But the women's movement has similar, totally human impulses toward stagnancy, right? Because it's really hard to grapple with this stuff. And so I think actually that having to have these conversations keeps us sharp in a way that we wouldn't have to. And even if the keeping it sharp is about, okay, so we have a group of women who are very ideologically different, and they enter the conversation and enter the movement. And in some cases, like you look at the Now elections, which, Susan Flutie writes about, and the Now elections of a couple of years ago, they actually entered Now and sort of may arguably either shifted the results of the National Organization for Women's elections. So you actually do have an incursion, a completely allowable and legitimate incursion of women of a different ideological cast into a women's movement. And I actually think that this is terrific for that women's movement because it forces us to stay sharp and to be more energetic and sink our teeth into what we believe and why we believe it and how do we articulate it and how do we keep up an ideological argument that is vibrant and relevant.
And also that combats this notion of the sort of, I'm not a feminist, but, right? I mean, the word feminist has taken on a certain cast in the last 20 years, which you can't avoid, right? People say I'm not a feminist, but which you say in your book is the generation that you come from. Yes. And I think, there's another strain of feminism, Nikki Haley, Sarah Palin, which people don't have, which certain group of people, maybe a large group of people, don't have that much ambivalence about,
Right. Well, I think, and also younger women, I think, have less ambivalence. And you do hear from older women, my daughter won't call herself a feminist, but I actually think that is changing and that, I do think it's changing. The one thing I do want to say, though, is another part of this complexity, as you point out, not coming from a southern state with a history of, where it's more challenging to be a woman. One of the things we have to remember, and I think about this all the time, is the fact that these Republican women and sort of woman power Republican women, though the use of the word feminism and the reliance on sort of feminist legacy symbolism is pretty new to this year. There is actually a huge history of tough Republican women. Often Republican women have been the kind of first governors and often in red states. Right. And one of the things we have to remember if we're on the left is that it's not as though our great progressive states like Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania have been friendly to women. I mean, Pennsylvania, not that, Pennsylvania remains a sort of purple state, but I grew up there. But Pennsylvania's never had female elected officials. New York, until Hillary Clinton, hadn't had a woman senator and hasn't had a woman governor.
And also, there's a different way in which women's advancement works, I have to say, in the Northeast, when it does work, which is very slow, very plodding, through the state legislatures, which don't pay very well, so they're more attractive to women than they are to men. It's this extremely painstaking system, which in the South, it's much more kind of explosive and culturally symbolic than in the Northeast sometimes.
Right, and when you talk also about less electoral and political issues and more social issues having to do with feminism, if you think about the great debate that enraptured so many of us some years ago, the opt-out revolution, which, depending on who you ask, was either anecdotally true or a false trend, which it seems to have been statistically, but the opt-out revolution in which, highly educated women were tossing their degrees and choosing to leave their high-powered careers and stay home with their kids. If you look at the segment of the population in which that was happening, it was in the very blue, very educated, very privileged, left-leaning communities. And then you look at people like Sarah Palin and her much more egalitarian marriage.
Right.
And the egalitarian marriages were often happening in less privileged communities where you needed a two-income household. And there wasn't an option.
I mean, that's where my end of men thesis is the strongest. I mean, just out of economic necessity, there's been a tremendous reversal in the working class in terms of who does what and who pulls the family weight. And, eventually that just filters down and starts to change the way people think about gender, whether you want it to or not. Let's move the end of this conversation now just to the Susan Faludi story, just because it's in both of our minds, and I think will allow us to talk about what the next generation is like, and so much as that we can, because neither of us is exactly from that next generation,
right.
But spend a lot of time kind of thinking and working with them. So just to briefly summarize, Susan Faludi wrote a story in Harper's of this month, which makes the argument that the mother-daughter divide is still the defining element of feminism. She talks somewhat dismissively, I would say, about the younger generation of feminists and the way that people often do. They have a kind of weightless, ahistorical feminism in which every choice is as good as any other choice, and that often they tend to put emphasis on the kind of aesthetic. She quotes blogs that talk about wonder bras as signs of a great feminist developments, and sort of the suffering of the older generation of feminists who are dismissed by this younger generation. And the story is told around the election for the National Organization of Women, and I would say that the anecdote that which is the sort of narrative thread through the story is kind of a mismatch with the point she's trying to make.
Because it was not, in fact, matricide, but infanticide?
What?
Because it was not matricide so much as it was infanticide?
Well, for many reasons, the story didn't quite illustrate her point, partly because the woman who was running for now President, Latifah Lyles, seems extremely serious and, was a very sober candidate and lost. Exactly. So it was more infanticide than matricide. And so, I think I think maybe there should have been two separate stories, or should have been somewhat complicated, because I can see, as a representative of an older generation of feminism, she has something to say about this weightless, ahistorical moment, and she should have kind of had that out with younger feminists, and it would have been a good moment. I also disagree with her, and then I'll turn it over to you, because I feel like, my surprise of the younger feminists, at least the ones who are represented on the blogosphere, who tend to be the most, the ones we see and read about the most, I find incredibly earnest and serious to a degree that I am surprised by almost all the time. I mean, they're much less ironic than even when I was in college, my generation of feminists. They seem to me a throwback to, a sort of maybe not 80s, maybe not 70s, maybe early 90s feminism, which preceded me. And so I am always confused by that, because I read that, we have this sort of lipstick, girls gone wild feminists, all they care about is their wonder bras. But in fact, when they do their writing, they're incredibly serious about movement politics and policy, and, pretty doctrinaire. And so I don't really know how to square those two views of the coming generation.
Yeah. I have so many.
Well, give us three of them. How about three of them?
Well, I mean, first of all, when I saw the Faludi piece, it was this weekend, and I just read it, and my mouth was hanging open. And there was such an irony because, she frames it all as matricide, as on the mother-daughter model, which I do. I have a chapter and sort of more than that in my book about exactly this generational divide and the attitudes that Faludi is outlining here. And so obviously I'm taking this argument very seriously, and I'm so eager to read what Faludi has to say about it. I feel myself very much caught in between the generations. I often find myself siding with elder women, but really believe that the future is in the hands of younger women. And, I feel very much caught. I'm not necessarily aligned on either side. However, the irony of reading Faludi's article where she's writing about matricide is that if my feminism has a mother, it's Susan Faludi, because I was not brought to consciousness by either Betty Friedan or Gloria Steinem or Bella Abzug. I was really brought to feminist consciousness by Backlash, which was published in 1991, I think.
Yes,
and, when I was in high school and I read it, probably didn't read it till college, but, so Faludi is the woman who totally, Backlash was so fundamental to me that it's not even like it's a book. It was just what life is, Right. And yet this article totally made me want to kill her. So,
Right.
It was the things that I objected to about it. And I also write about the now election story in Latifah Lyles in my book very, very briefly, but she didn't take into account the kind of other forces that were at work within that election, but also that the election ended with, as you say, the young woman, the very serious young woman, being beaten by the older woman and the establishment feminists. And this didn't jive at all with the article, but also the thing that drove me nuts about it, and again, I have written about this as a mother-daughter divide, so I don't, it would be totally hypocritical for me to criticize this, but the overwrought and dramatic language of how feminism is barren, I wanted to shake my fist, sort of like, because why do we talk only about feminism this way? There's no acknowledgement, there's a fetishizing of feminism as particularly dysfunctional in this kind of familial way and in this reproductive way, barren feminism. Come on, look at the conversations that have been had regarding the civil rights movement's evolution and how, and Barack Obama's candidacy, and the way that young African Americans and Barack Obama himself was not paying due to the civil rights leaders of his past, that he was winning this election. The resentments that boiled over between Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and the younger generation of African Americans and the resentments about leaving this generation aside.
Well, you know what it is? There are links missing the story, because she does have a section which is historical. But interestingly, it's like she comes to the wrong conclusion from the thing that she's describing. All movements, women's movements, civil rights movements, technological movements, any argument that you have about progress is always consumed by rifts between the founding generation or a founding generation or the prevailing generation and the next generation, right? It's an inherent tension, I would say. There's nothing dooming to feminism about it. It's just inherent in movements, in any
the notion of men.
It's true in the Republican Party. You can see the Republican establishment and the kind of up-and-coming Tea Partiers, if you want to put it in age terms, as having the same conversation as the younger generation of feminists. And I think it would have been much more interesting to talk about kind of what the younger feminists don't respect, because I think she's onto something about the kind of, not necessarily the weightlessness, but about the ahistoricness and the choice part. I think that's where the interesting conversation is to be had. If I were to describe the younger generation, they are much more comfortable with a much wider variety of choices even than I am. There are places where I draw the line. Take my husband's name, which to them it's like, some people do, some people don't. Some people work, some people don't. I think they do have a kind of wider array of choices that are fine and not considered heretical. And then you can talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It does lead to this ridiculous, I'm going to get naked and put on my Wonder Bra, and that's a feminist statement, and that's particularly kind of annoying in a culture which is pornified and, is problematic, which, if and when you have a daughter, you'll see. Then you start to think differently about these things. But on the other hand, it is, it's not unnatural and it's not a death knell.
And there's no acknowledgement.
Natural.
There's no acknowledgement that, yes, even if there is this sort of youthful exuberance for the Wonder Bra or whatever, which I see as a very small part of the feminism that I see expressed around me by younger women, but that even if you were to say, no, it's a much larger part, what she doesn't take into account is the very loud, persuasive voices arguing against that. Look at Ariel Levy. Ariel Levy, I believe, is in her mid-30s. Look at Jessica Valenti. Now, she quotes her briefly in this piece, and there are all kinds of arguments about feministing and Jezebel, but there's no acknowledgement of the fact that the counterbalances to that are being produced by other young women too. It's not as though it's just older women who are policing a kind of girls gone wild sexuality. It's young women who are doing it too. The complaints about are, that young women didn't care about Hillary Clinton's candidacy. Well, I mean, again, I know I'm not super young, but I'm 35 and I just wrote a book about it, and the previous books about it were by Anne Kornbluth, who I believe is also 35, and Leslie Sanchez. I mean, these are not second wave women who are taking Hillary Clinton's candidacy and the gender dynamics of politics seriously enough to write books. It's younger women too. She doesn't seem to give space for in her desire to make her complaints, and I believe they're valid, and I believe they're worthwhile, and I couldn't wait to read her on it,
Well, it's funny, I felt that the piece was most moving as a kind of emotional cry, like as a sort of portrait, an anthropological portrait of a certain generation that's been declared irrelevant and which is feeling all this anger, and it seemed to me that I actually found quite moving. Like it ends with the portrait of a woman, sitting by herself in a room after the election, and she's a professor, and she has gotten these comments from her students like, you're teaching an irrelevant form of feminism.
Yes.
This is 60s feminism. It doesn't mean anything to us. And then this woman, head down, body slouched, all the body language you would expect from such a poignant vision. I felt like a true kind of honest emotional exploration of this moment for that generation of feminists would have been great. Like, really would have told me something, because there's poignancy, there's a kind of letting go that needs to happen, there's an anger at the young feminist, there's a whole range of kind of emotions that are there, which are, which don't need to be connected to a larger political or a philosophical point. They just are. It's just a snapshot, of this moment, and that would have been great.
I totally agree about how moving that was. The women's studies professor who said there's just not room for my kind of teaching anymore. But I also thought of something, and this is, I don't think I actually have direct reference to this in my book, but while I was reporting my book, because I wanted to see if my instincts about young people being more interested in gender politics than they had been, for example, when I was in college many years ago, I asked the many professors who I know. My mother is an English professor, my aunt is an English and professor and feminist at Columbia. I interviewed Margot Jefferson, who teaches about gender and culture and race at Columbia and the New School. I asked all these academics that I knew if they sensed any difference in recent years amongst their students, both undergraduates and graduates. And I got from everybody the same answer, which is that, in fact, the interest and investment in talking about gender had amped up in the past 5 years. Now, that doesn't take away from Faluti's final poignant scene, because I do believe there are obviously different strains of how we teach feminism and women's studies, and I am persuaded by the fact that a certain kind of teaching is going away, and certainly that a certain generation of academics is being to some degree left in the dust. But again, there's no room for this other part of the picture, which is, I believe, an increased engagement in these issues from young people, even within precisely the setting she's talking about, an academic setting.
Right, and that would, that kind of thing would have allowed her to say, okay, so the election kind of went the wrong, the election ended up validating something which is not actually an emotional or cultural reality, and then sort of to talk about that. It's like you start with the election and then you move on to talk about everything else, instead of, I guess the piece was just kind of confused, right? It didn't connect all its various thoughts and feelings, and maybe she can write a book about it.
Well, she is writing a book. This is, I believe, I don't know, I've heard that she is writing a book on exactly this topic, the generational differences within feminism, which I have been dying to read because I so respect her work, and she's been so influential for me. And again, I'm not allergic or immediately dismissive of any of these complaints, the generational complaints. I'm fascinated by them, but I just think this piece wasn't coherent and did some stuff that I really fundamentally did disagree with.
Right, absolutely. Okay, I feel on that note we might be able to wrap it up.
I believe that's probably true.
Yes. But congratulations on your new book.
Thank you, and thank you for your very, very, very smart and sensitive review of it the other day.
Absolutely. And it's called Big Girls Don't Cry, for viewers at the end of this, listeners, I guess. And good luck with everything else. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye, Hannah.